It's the Sittin Sportside podcast, exclusively on 1045theteam.com.
It is the Sittin Sportside podcast right here on 1045theteam.com. You can listen on the free 1045 The Team app, or you can go to youtube.com/team1045. Find all our videos there, including 1045theteam.com. Podcast tab will take you there as well. I am Eric Hanneman. Another edition of the Fantasy Baseball 2019 podcast. I hope these are helping you with your draft day strategy for fantasy baseball. I know that it's helping me prepare for my drafts, and if that is the only consolation of nobody finding this useful, I will personally take it. We're going through the shortstop position today, as, of course, if you listen to some of the other ones, if you haven't, of course, I gave you a bunch of other ways that you can listen to them. I'm going to those sites. There's all of them there, and by all I mean the catcher position, the first base position, and the second base position. We're doing shortstop today, and of course there are 6 players that really killed it down the stretch in 2018 that I profiled. That was one of our most popular podcasts of all time, surprisingly, not to toot my own horn. And there is a player on that list that we will talk about today, so I'm looking forward to that. If you haven't been listening, we start off with which player from this position should be taken over the off the board first, and where is that quote-unquote acceptable in my personal opinion. And from there we go with, is the number 2 guy worth taking over the number 1? Then we go throughout the next top 200 players to talk about those. We get into the deep sleepers, and then we get into the deep sleepers. So let's start off with, when is it acceptable to take the first shortstop off the board? And this one is probably going to be either Trey Turner or Francisco Lindor. And when you hear that, you're thinking to yourself, oh, well, most likely you're okay with taking Lindor over Turner. Not this year. And maybe Lindor falls in these rankings because it's tough right now, because some of these rankings are not based on what we know. And we don't know a lot about Francisco Lindor's injury. Not to start about that off the bat, but he's definitely going to miss the beginning of the season is what we know right now. But when it was reported, they were saying 7 to 9 weeks, which was about a week ago, which would make it about 2 months from then, which is mid-April. That's not that much time to miss. So he for all intents and purposes, this is a guy in Francisco Lindor that should be taken in the early parts of the drafts, regardless now, when you look at it that way. A guy who had 277 last year with 38 long balls and 25 stolen bases. There are 2 players on the Cleveland Indians, and we'll get to the other one in the third base podcast, that are just really, really good, and Lindor is one of them. But Trey Turner is still my guy. Trey Turner is still the guy that I would take first overall. I think it's acceptable to take Lindor over Turner if we know, if by your draft day you know Francisco Lindor is doing well on his way back from his injury, then I am all for taking Francisco Lindor over Trey Turner. And I think you could even put Manny Machado in that conversation now that he is signed in San Diego. But that calf injury for Francisco Lindor doesn't seem serious enough for me at this juncture on February 21st when I am recording this podcast, that I wouldn't necessarily want to take him in the first round, possibly over Trey Turner. But to me, then Turner is no definite to stay healthy the entire season. When you rely on your legs, things could happen that really, hinders what happens. But Trey Turner is probably the number 1 guy of shortstop in fantasy, and one of the best all-around players in fantasy, to be quite frank. His 271 average last year leaves something to be desired because of what he had did in the first couple of seasons, especially in 2016, when it was just half a season. But when he came up and hit 342 with 13 home runs and 33 stolen bases, the sky was the limit for this kid. So the expectations around Trey Turner seemed that he was going to be able to get you, with a full season, 20 home runs, at least. I guess the expectation was 20 home runs and about 65 stolen bases. He has not gotten to either one of those thresholds, and not really even close. Besides last year, almost got 20 home runs. He ended up with 19. But for stolen bases, the most he's had in his career was in 2017 with 46. But the thing this guy is definitely going to get you, Trey Turner, is he's going to score you a ton of runs. Last year with 103. He's going to steal you a ton of bases and be one of the top in the league no matter what, with the 43 exemplified last season, was one of the tops. I believe it was a top in the National League. Not many stolen bases at all last year. He might have been the most in the Major League Baseball. And then the 271 average to me is not great, but it's something that is there with a guy who's going to get you 20 home runs and 40-something stolen bases. He in 103 runs scored and a really respectable runs batted in for a leadoff guy was 73. Look, this is the guy you need to take. You need to take him in the first round. He, especially in your roto leagues, but even in your points leagues, the total bases are there. The stolen bases, especially if they're very valuable in your league, where I think in my league it's 2 points for stolen bases, not necessarily the conventional standard 1. So I think that the stolen bases are so important for Trey Turner on all the thresholds, and for a points league too. The total bases, including the stolen bases, makes him really warranted a first round selection. And as I said earlier, there's probably 2 players, if not 3 players, that are worth taking over him. Actually, Javier Baez was the guy that I said I'm okay with taking Baez over Jose Altuve. Well, he's also shortstop eligible, Baez is, and third base eligible. So I'd have to mention him here. I'm not sure I'd take him over the other 4, though. Trey Turner, Francisco Lindor, I mentioned Manny Machado, and also to Alex Bregman. I think those 4 are all interchangeable in some capacity, depending on, especially in your roto leagues, in your category leagues, if there's certain stats that you're looking for a little bit more than the other. Maybe if you want the stolen bases, which I think a lot of people kind of key in on, Turner's your definite number 1. That's why he's probably the favorite, and I think it should continue to be the favorite. But a guy like Alex Bregman and Francisco Lindor, who are hitting 30-plus home runs and driving in 100 runs, those are players that are very important. Lindor is probably the balance between the two. He had more home runs than Bregman, and he had 25 stolen bases, which is close to, not close enough to what Turner is, but no, close to what Turner is, but not close enough per se, but it's there, or no, it is close enough. I stand by that. It is close enough. And someone like Manny Machado, I think out of all 4, to be quite frankly, and Lindor had a really good average last year, he's probably going to get you the most consistent in terms of where you're looking at the 37 home runs along with 37 or closer on there for Lindor. So Machado, say what you want about the ballpark not being the most ideal, I still think he's a guy you're willing to take. You're willing to take around the first round too, but to me it's unquestionably Trey Turner. But I don't think you're crazy and out of the realm of, in the realm of idiocracy if you're taking either Lindor, Machado, or Bregman over Turner. I just think that it's 100% Trey Turner is the guy to take first at the shortstop position. Let's fall down a little bit here and talk about Trevor Story and Carlos Correa, 2 guys who are on very much opposite ends of the spectrum. Trevor Story is coming off a really, sorry to do it, but a storied season last year where he just really kind of came out of nowhere in terms of stolen bases, going back to that position, that stat of stolen bases at 27. I'm not sure you're going to get that again from Trevor Story. But the 30 home runs are right there on par with the rest of the shortstop position. So he's right up there with you at a 291 average. He plays his home games in Colorado. I mentioned in the Second Base podcast that I love Daniel Murphy this season because if he plays the entire season the way he has been the last 3 seasons at Colorado boost, that's huge. So Trevor Story really falls right into that mix. With 37 home runs and 27 stolen bases, you don't have to worry about strikeouts if you're in a category league. So go all 4 Trevor Story if you want to wait around and let somebody else go with the other guys. For a points league, I think you're looking at the other guys that you'd rather have. Obviously, they're a steeper price, just by a little bit though, because Story's ranked as a third rounder. So I think you're looking at where Story is at in the points league and saying that strikeouts are going to hinder my drafting of him over possibly reaching or trying to grab one of the other 4 earlier on. But I still think that Trevor Story, while the stolen bases aren't something that I don't think that will get back to 27 this season, I've been proven wrong plenty of times before, and he could be determined to prove critics like me or haters like me wrong and go out, and he might go out and do that and steal more than 27 bases. Who knows? If you're someone who is very bullish on the fact that he could do that again, then take him just as early, if not, as a guy like Bregman. I mean, because the numbers are there, especially in a rotisserie league, a category-based league. Strikeouts are a little much for my taking in a points league to take him higher than probably the mid to late second, early third round. Carlos Correa, like as I mentioned, though, he's on the opposite end of the spectrum. He's coming off a really down year, injury-ridden, but just not a good year when he even did play. Overall, he ended up with a 239 average, something to be a lot to be desired. Only 15 home runs. Stolen bases aren't even close to any of the guys I mentioned earlier. Even Alex Bregman, his shortstop counterpart, who had probably got shortstop eligibility because of Correa's injury last season, was at 10 compared to his 3. So just a really poor showing from Carlos Correa. But hey, just to bring my league back into this, he's still being kept. And sure, there's a lot of factors into how people keep people. Especially in my league, we get 3 keepers, and they're kept for a maximum of 5 years of where they were drafted. And Carlos Correa was in when he was first kept. He was kept as a 25th round draft pick. So sure, of course, that's huge, value there. But still, I think that there's a lot of faith that Correa can continue to do what he had done in the previous seasons. He's still only 24 years old. He's still a rising star, a lot of people think, in this league. But even before that, the 315 average was great in 2017. This isn't a guy who's hitting your 30 home runs. He only hit 24 that season. He had an injury there as well. Even in his close to 600 AB season in 2016, he only had 20 home runs and 139 strikeouts, which is only a handful away from Trevor Story, and he's not giving you the 30-plus home runs. He's not giving you the close to 15 to 25 stolen bases that Lindor and even Story were giving you. So to me, Carlos Correa is a guy that kind of, I'm not even sure even at his most prime that we know him of, is that great of a fantasy player in terms of a top 40 player. But put him in the top 50 because the discussion, especially with shortstop eligibility, he's definitely a middle term. Carlos Correa is definitely a middle tier shortstop that I'm willing to take in the 5th or 6th round. But I'm not overall, like in the rankings that I'm using for these podcasts, he's at 42. I'm not sure I take him that high. I think a guy like Xander Bogaerts, who's ranked similarly around him, even Gleyber Torres, who I wasn't hepped on the second base podcast, might be guys that I'm willing to maybe take a chance on because the average could be better. The home runs wouldn't be far off from what we've seen in the last few seasons, and maybe they'd steal more bases. Not Torres, really, and Bogaerts only had 8. But they're right on par, in my opinion, with what Carlos Correa has shown. And Bogaerts has been proven that he can hit for average. Last year, 288. Previous season to that, or especially in 2015, he had 320, 294 the next year, 2016. So he's got a more consistent batting average than Correa, even though Correa's good year was a good year in terms of average. The power numbers aren't necessarily there to put him over the top of even guys like Bogaerts. Moving down the spectrum here, we're looking at Gene Segura, Corey Seager, hovering around the 10 and 11 marks of shortstop eligible players. Of course, guys like Javier Baez and Gleyber Torres are double eligible, including Alex Bregman at third base, and even Machado will be third base eligible at some point. So keep that in mind when you draft some of these players. Segura is a really good player. I continue to think that year after year, he's a guy that I'm willing to take in the mid rounds, especially a 6th rounder. Sure, I'll take him there. And Corey Seager, I look at Corey Seager and say, look, this is a guy who's an all-star, and I know he's coming back from Tommy John surgery. That's not necessarily something that you don't necessarily come back right away from. The lingering issues in my opinion, I only really look at those as lingering issues possibly playing in the field. Maybe that's a big deal, maybe it's not, but he's still a guy that I'm willing to take, a guy that hovers around 300 when he plays a full season, who's still hitting in the 20s in home runs. The RBIs maybe need to be a little bit higher if you'd like them to be a little bit higher. The runs scored are good. So ultimately, he's not giving you the stolen base returns to some of these other guys that I mentioned. But ultimately, if you're getting him in the 6th round, if people are still concerned about his arm from coming back from the Tommy John, I personally say don't worry about it at all. Go out and draft Corey Seager because I think that if you're getting him at a cheap price, that's the best you can do. So go out and draft Corey Seager in the 6th to 7th round. Let's pick this up a little bit in the middle rounds here. A big time name that I think that was kind of not necessarily a big-time name last year, but really could have won you leagues as Jose Peraza, especially if you were in the category-based leagues because the stolen bases were there for him, and that he continues to be ranked higher because of the stolen bases. The problem is the Reds have gotten a lot better, in my personal opinion, in terms of players that are going to be hitting at the top of the lineup, and if he gets taken off the top of the lineup, if the replacement for Brian Price, I'll get his name momentarily, forgot it. It takes a man to admit that, okay? Okay, I forgot his name. But, if he's not hitting in the top of that lineup, then that hurts. David Bell, says that's the manager name. There it is, quick research. Thanks, intern. Just kidding, we don't have an intern. But if he really puts Eugenio Suarez up there or Joey Votto up there and changes that lineup to where he's hitting in the lower half of the lineup, that's going to hurt Jose Peraza's value. But but he's right there with Tim Anderson and the guy that I alluded to at the top of the podcast that I've talked about previously on a Fantasy Baseball 2019 podcast, Adalberto Mondesi. Tim Anderson compared to Peraza and Adalberto Mondesi, those are all in the same area. Peraza ended up with 23 stolen bases last season, so the fact that number is going to get you higher is good, I guess. The 288 average is great, but let's compare it to what Tim Anderson did. 26 stolen bases with 20 home runs. The average wasn't there. Adalberto Mondesi in very limited action, 14 home runs, 32 stolen bases. As much as I have not simmered down, but as much as I have some skepticism of Adalberto Mondesi being able to do that for a full season, I'm in the 10th or 11th round, and I have a choice between Peraza, Anderson, and Adalberto Mondesi. I'm 1,000% taking Mondesi because we've seen that the ceiling and the Trey Turner type numbers are there. They're possible there for the taking. That guy won you a league last year, probably, or at least got you close to it. He was sensational down the stretch. For more on that, watch or listen to that podcast that I did about the 6 players that absolutely killed it down the stretch. He was one of them, and I'll tell you all about it. But in this particular podcast about shortstops, I am taking my chance on that ceiling than Peraza and Anderson. That's just me personally. And not that I don't like Peraza or Anderson, but Machado not going to the White Sox, that lineup isn't great. If Eloy Jimenez doesn't come up until midseason, I'm not sure there's enough power there for Tim Anderson to increase what he did last season, which was a good year, 24 home runs, right? 20 stolen bases, something like that. But that needs to be better. I'm not sure he's a guy that can get you there. Let's talk about some mid-round picks that could really help you out here. Ahmed Rosario is kind of being ranked relatively high. He had a pretty good end of last season, and he's in a better lineup. So I 100% take a look at Ahmed Rosario and say, look, why not? If I need stolen bases at this point, go for Ahmed Rosario. The problem is power numbers, I'm not necessarily ever going to get there for him. And I would rather personally, in these mid-rounds, look at a guy like Elvis Andrus, who has the track record, had a down year last year. Injury happened. He came back and wasn't the same guy. But the way he has played in the past with the stolen bases and home runs, I am 1,000% looking at taking him over Ahmed Rosario, Elvis Andrus. In a points league, I'm taking Andrelton Simmons because he's getting on base. He's doing a great job of putting the bat on the ball and not striking out a lot. So I am taking Andrus and Simmons over Ahmed Rosario personally, actually, in points leagues. But Rosario is a guy that has a ceiling that's starting to take off a little bit, but the floor is not great. It's not great, especially if they believe, and I know Jed Lowry, since the last podcast, that's the last time I've been on with you, had an injury, so keep that in mind now when you're thinking about the second base position. But if he's healthy enough and they think that he can play shortstop, who's to say that Rosario, if you could play Frazier at third and Alonso at first or whoever, then Rosario couldn't come out of that lineup, and I think he could. So the floor is very low on Rosario, but the ceiling continues to grow. I think he can become a really good player, especially if he gets that average up to 280s, 290s. I really like what Ahmed Rosario could do, but I'm still taking Andrelton Simmons and Elvis Andrus over him. I might even think about Eduardo Escobar and Paul DeJong. Paul DeJong, I think, I look at him and I say, he could have a really good year with this team, the Cardinals team that has improved this offseason. And we know what he can do when he is healthy. And in limited numbers, still 436 ABs, 19 home runs. I'll take it. With Paul DeJong. But for a points league, he strikes out too much for my liking. In terms of, but he's a good late round pick. Last but not least, like I talked about with Eduardo Escobar before we get into these deep sleepers, Eduardo Escobar, man, a lot of doubles last year. Total bases, that's a guy you're looking at. So for a points league, he might not be the worst guy to get with shortstop and third base eligibility late in your drafts for maybe a utility position. Let's talk about some sleepers. Jorge Polanco of the Minnesota Twins. I think he's been very good when he gets the opportunity, but it's a sleeper. Mind you, it's a sleeper. A sleeper with a lot of potential, Willy Adames of the Tampa Bay Rays. I think he's a guy that, if he really puts things together, you're looking at a lot of home runs, and you're looking at a healthy average. He ended up with 278 last year. You look at the splits, he did really, really good in the month of September, hitting 341 with 2 home runs and 11 RBIs. And in August, he also had 318. So you're looking at a guy who was trending upward to the end of the season. He's a guy I think who can get you in the 20s in the home runs. The total bases could get a lot higher if he starts hitting for more extra base hits. But the average is something that improved late last season. I'm a believer in Willy Adames. That's a guy. That's a sleeper with potential. That's a sleeper with top 15. Who even knows? Maybe top 20 potential. Well, top 15, top 20, top 15, maybe even top 10 potential if things really take off. I don't love going that far, but he's a regular sleeper. That I think can go far. Let's go to the deep sleepers, or just regular. Didi Gregorius, I don't know where he's going in drafts. On this particular thing right here, this particular rankings, they just have him rank him high. But I'm of the mindset Didi Gregorius could come back probably in May. Now, I predicted in my article on 1045theteam.com that he would play in May as a bold prediction, like one of those outrageous predictions that you think could be true, and you want to really get thread the needle on that one or move the needle and let people be like, no way. But I'm still of the mindset that he could come back around that time if the Yankees wanted him to. They have so many options that they're not going to push him back that far. But he's still a guy that's going to come back around. And also break and have a heavy impact, in my personal opinion, on championship rosters. So depending on how many DL slots you have, that's a guy I take probably in the no later than the 12th to 15th rounds and stash him. Especially if you missed out on some of the top ones that we talked about at the top of the podcast. Some other guys to take a look at that are deep sleepers. Garrett Hampson of Colorado, if he gets everyday playing time at second base, which is wide open. We talked about Ryan McMahon on the first base podcast and second base podcast. I'm not sure I brought him up there, but he'll have that eligibility if he plays it. There's going to be a wide open position, and Garrett Hampson is right on that list of potential everyday player at second base. But or shortstop. No, Trevor Story. But he'll have the shortstop eligibility. And who knows? Story had injury history in the past. We do know that Brendan Rodgers is a guy for Colorado that will come up at some point. But I like the chances of Garrett Hampson to be an impact player this year. If he gets the chance, it's going to come down between him and Ryan McMahon. Brandon Crawford is another guy that I think that has the potential to be really good and be a point guy, especially in a deep points league. He's a guy who will probably get you some points. Scott Kingery, if he gets the opportunity in Philadelphia, I'm not sure. With Manny Machado not signing there, he'll probably get an opportunity there, especially if Mike Franco at third base doesn't do great. So he has that shortstop eligibility. Look for him to bounce back after he looked like he was poised for a really great rookie year, which it wasn't. I mentioned Brendan Rodgers. Keep your eye on him. J.P. Crawford, the guy that came over from Philadelphia in Seattle, probably will have an opportunity at some point this year, and he's got that Dansby Swanson type of thing where he's got the prospect name, but doesn't necessarily put everything together. There's another name, though, Dansby Swanson, to keep an eye on to see if he can really come into his own finally on a Braves team. He showed flashes last season, but the consistency was not great, especially for fantasy purposes. And then Fernando Tatis Jr. is a guy to keep your eye on, and whether he's going to get he's the number one prospect according to Keith Law of ESPN. So of all baseball, and obviously Troy Tulowitzki is a guy. Maybe take a chance on late in your drafts if you're looking for an early season beneficiary of the Didi Gregorius injury. Last but not least, I'll throw out some names. Addison Russell. I don't know what's going on with that case. I think he's suspended for a decent amount of times, but he's a guy to just think about possibly. Hernan Perez, Ledmus Diaz, those are two guys that are playing on teams that have a lot of good players in Milwaukee and Houston, respectively. But if they get opportunities, they've shown what they can do in the past. And then last but not least, I got to mention people that we've talked about in other podcasts, like Lourdes Gurriel Jr., who is also eligible at second base. And, of course, third straight podcast, so we've mentioned this guy, but Marwin Gonzalez, he's got that eligibility at shortstop as well. So wherever he signs and wherever he ends up, he could be a guy, if he finds everyday playing time, that could be really good position eligibility at shortstop. He could be the shortstop that you need. He also could be the second baseman that you need. He could be the first baseman you need. Could be the outfielder you need. So depending if he gets everyday playing time, that could be a name to really, really keep your eye on as well. Let's talk about the last but not least, the essential pick. This is where I tell you my essential shortstop pick of where he's best valued. This is based on talent and value, but I think that overall the value of this guy is where you need to be drafted, and this is really tough for me. I think that it's tied. I think this is my first tie of the fantasy baseball podcast year. Trey Turner and Francisco Lindor are worth the first-round pick. They're worth the returns there. They're guys that are going to help you win your leagues. They're guys that if you take in the first round, if you're lucky enough to get them past the first round, that are going to help you win the league, especially if Lindor falls. He's a guy who's going to be able to hit 30 home runs for you, steal 20 bases, and have an average close to 300. That is going to help you win championships. So ultimately, I think it could end up being Lindor over Turner with the injury possibly driving his value down. But the way I look at it is that's a guy who's going to be out for 2 weeks. I still take him in the first round, late first round, early second round if he's there. My essential pick is a tie between Trey Turner and Francisco Lindor, but Lindor could win out because of his injury driving down his value for some other possible fantasy owners in your leagues that you might be able to take advantage of. So there's no clear middle round guy that I think is more valuable than taking a guy early. For shortstop, it's Lindor and Turner. And like I said, Lindor could really prove, if that injury drives people away, to be a huge bargain. And I don't know if second round is a bargain, but he's definitely a first round talent in my opinion, right with Trey Turner, and that could really help you win your league. He's been very, very solid for a Cleveland team that might be getting worse year after year. Lineup, though, I think could have gotten a little bit better this year. The outfield is so suspect in Cleveland. And, of course, I'll talk to you about all the NMLB teams at some point in March when we do our division previews. That being said, this is our shortstop preview. Thank you for listening. As you guys know, at EricH1045, at MikeJames1045, at Sportside Tweets. Whenever you want to tweet at us, especially at EricH1045, me. If you have any fantasy baseball questions, I am willing to take them. I will answer you back on Twitter. I'll answer them on this podcast. I can't wait to talk to you guys throughout the season on the Sittin Sportside podcast about fantasy baseball. I would love to field some questions for you guys as well. YouTube.com/team1045. You can get there from our 1045theteam.com page on the podcast tab, Sittin Sportside Podcast on that tab. And as I mentioned before, there's some really good interviews from the Hall of Fame Classics of years past with the likes of guys like, Kelly Johnson was a great interview. If you remember the name Andy Sonnenstein, he's on that menu, if you will. Wade Boggs, great interviews that we had there. Luis Sojo. I mean, these are some really fun interviews. If you missed them, they're still relevant enough, I think, today, and they're fun interviews to think about. I mean, if you watch It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, I asked Wade Boggs about his appearance on that show. So I'm very, very happy to continue to promote those. But I'm happy that you also listen to this podcast. I want to thank you again, and we will have. And I mentioned on the previous podcast that we're going to have podcasts up. Mike James and I yesterday. Well, the snow came into play, so we will have more podcasts, with the risk of possibly promoting something that doesn't happen again. But why do you care? This happens all the time, and no one notices. Like if I promise something on this podcast, does anyone hear it? Just like if a tree falls in the woods, does anyone hear it? But anyway, should have some of those podcasts that I teased earlier about the Manny Machado reaction, other MLB reactions, Jets. Off-season expectations, as well as our first ever movie discussion podcast, should be up tomorrow, Friday, at the very latest Saturday. But we're really hoping that you guys listen to that as well. The snow got in the way. Look out for those podcasts, and also look out for what third base is coming up, then outfield, then starting pitching, and then relief pitching. Hopefully, some big guys sign before I do those podcasts. If not, I will continue to do those podcasts and tell you what I think about those players, regardless of where they sign. I'm looking at you, Bryce Harper. They're offering you more than $300 million. You're taking that. Otherwise, you're going to make Mike Trout a $400 million man sometime soon. So thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. We will see you next time on the Sittin Sportside Podcast on 1045theteam.com and the free 1045 The Team app.